皆さんこんにちは。これより京都大学学術研究展開センターの対談企画文理の森を開催します。私は同センターの藤川と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いします。この文理の森という企画は京都大学の研究者同士が専門分野を超えて語り合い、文理融合のあり方をさまざまな角度から語り合うというものです。理系文系の枠を超えて対話することの面白さ、そこに生まれてくるつながりの豊かさや新たな研究、学問の可能性といったことを模索していこうという企画です。本日は医学研究科で臨床心理学をご専門とされているイーサンサーカー先生、そして文学研究科で倫理学、哲学を専門とされているマイケル・キャンベル先生にお越しいただいております。この後の対話は英語で行っていきます。So, thank you so much for coming for today. And please, I would like to first ask you to introduce yourselves.
Thank you very much, Futaba-san, and thank you for this opportunity. My name is Michael Campbell. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Ethics at Kyoto University. I work on issues in ethics and the philosophy of mind, and especially the intersection between those two.
And my name is Ethan Socker. I'm an assistant professor in Kyoto University Graduate School of Medicine and the Medical Education Center. I'm a counseling psychologist, which is a clinical psychology specialty from the United States, and I specialize in well, clinically, I specialize in trauma treatments, and my research is in the area of substance use treatment, population health, and clinical epidemiology. Thank you. よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you so much. So, Michael sensei is philosopher working in ethics, and Isan sensei is clinical psychologist, and you did the project together.
Right.
Your specialties are different, but you did a project together, the workshop event called Philosophy and Psychology Academic Exchange under the Kyoto University's 分野横断 project, which is a cross-sectoral research platform development program. So that's last year. So how did that happen?
Yeah, that all started because I gave a Meet Your KU Community talk about a year ago, which was just a lunchtime presentation, about 10 minutes, presenting my research on Gestalt psychology, which was a movement in psychology that was popular in the mid-20th century. I'm looking at the ways in which Gestalt psychology conceives of the mind and how the mind relates to other sort of categories in the human. And I was hoping to find some collaborators, some people to work with, because my approach is very theoretical. So I just gave a little sort of 10-minute talk on that and my orientation, and Ethan attended it, and he asked me a challenging question after the presentation, and that's what sort of kicked off our collaboration together.
Wow, what's the challenging question?
Well, honestly, I was a little upset at what he said and thought, you can't do that. So his research is very theoretical, and I'm more applied clinical research. And he was talking about applying some Gestalt techniques to what I thought were patients. And I said, are you able to do this? Can you do that? And of course, no, he can't, but he, started this, well, maybe we can do something together.
Yeah, the phrase that I used, I think, was creating frameworks for conceptualizing recovery from injurious experiences. And Ethan's, pushback on that was, look, aren't frameworks for recovering from injury, isn't this a matter for clinicians? Clinicians are the ones who apply frameworks and use them in practice, and so we're the ones who should be formulating them. What can philosophy do here?
Yeah.
And so I very much appreciated that. I think that when it comes to understanding injurious experience, understanding things like trauma, this is one part of everyone has to go through this process of making sense of their own lives and integrating difficult experiences that they've had into their own meaning that they find in the world. And so I think part of that work is going to be humanistic, and part of that work is going to involve disciplines in the humanities. But I also think definitely, unquestionably, part of that is clinical and therapeutic. And so I think it's very much shared work. And what I was hoping to do was to use a provocative phrasing there to see if I could smoke out someone who would be willing to push back on me when I get excessively optimistic about what philosophy can achieve.
You set a trap.
I set a trap. I set a trap.
And
yeah.
it worked.
And stepped in the trap.
Yeah.
So you did the event last year. How was it? And I'm curious who attended and what kind of conversations?
Yes. So we started talking together, and we sort of had a meeting or two, exchanged some emails, and decided that we would apply, as you mentioned already, for this Bunri No Mori cross-sectoral grant. And Ethan was, I was sort of, unfortunately, after we got that, I then fell quite seriously ill for a few months. So the bulk of the organization was left to Ethan on his own. But together we managed to put together a workshop, sort of a 3-day workshop on Zoom, involving a group of psychologists and a group of philosophers, looking at some of the theoretical foundations of CBT and trying to understand whether there might be any philosophical issues raised by those frameworks, and whether philosophy might have any informing role there. Vice versa, whether the clinical experience that Ethan's colleagues could bring to the table could help philosophers in better understanding what we mean when we're using the words that sort of philosophers and psychologists have in common, words like trauma, words like belief, words like cognition,
Well, honestly, it was similar to our challenge experience carried over to this workshop that we did, where we were bridging the gap between philosophy and psychology, which honestly is, compared to other disciplines, a very small gap. It's easy for us to bridge our ideas, I think. And we had 6 speakers over 3 days.
Yes.
And each day we had a philosopher and a psychologist who would present and discuss and challenge each other and try and find commonalities between those 2 sectors of research. Yeah. It was pretty well attended, I feel like.
I think it was one of the highlights of the event for me was how engaged the audience were as well. Yeah. So I was, one worry that I had with this was that we would be speaking past each other. It's always the danger when you have 2 different disciplines, is that simply maybe the questions or methodologies that interest psychologists or clinicians might simply not strike a chord with philosophers, and vice versa. Their approach might seem too applied for us, and ours might seem too disengaged for them. So that was a worry that I had, but that turned out not to be the case. The discussion was quite fruitful, but also I was very impressed by the way in which the students attended and the audience members felt comfortable participating and expressing their own opinions, which sort of ranged from sort of philosophical observations about cultural differences, to also, describing their own experiences. And so it's like that engagement from students and from the audience reassured me that the event was really worthwhile, that there was a sort of hunger for work that occurs at the interstices of these 2 disciplines, where the 2 disciplines are sort of meeting.
That's interesting. So there have been so many ideas or potential collaboration or any seeds for developing possibilities. Can you share some of the something that happened after the event?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, after all of these discussions, one of the biggest surprising things was how involved the students were and how many questions they had about mental health and about different kinds of therapy. And I had this idea for a while, and I think this, coming out of this, spawned the idea to start a group therapy outlet for Kyodai students. And we would start with international students specifically because they have unique difficulties being in a foreign country and not having supports that they're used to having in their home countries, and then expand that eventually to include also Japanese students with group facilitators speaking Japanese as well. And that came out of a lot of our work. And, you know, how can we apply this together, theoretically, clinically, and help out our community, our Kyodai community, in the best way that I think we could do. And that student counseling project has come out of that.
Well, interesting. How is that going on?
It's a work in progress because we need a lot of university support to develop a sense of community for the students. And so we're busy working, trying to get different people from Kyodai, from different areas, who can support such a student counseling group, because we want it to be self-sustaining and last and and that requires a lot of university support. So we're applying for funding at this moment from different areas, spirits grants, outside grants, internal grants as well, other internal grants as well, and trying to develop a model at the same time. So there's a lot of work. Actually, it's more work than I had anticipated at the beginning, which is usually the case with research, I think.
So, going back to the event, may I ask, what was the intention of the workshop?
Sure. For the Bunri No Mori workshop, yeah. I think my intentions with this were to try to build links within the university. I wanted to see if there were other people working in a practical or a clinical or engaged context who would be interested in collaborating with philosophers of mind on sort of practical issues, or the intersection of practical and theoretical issues. I also wanted to build some links with psychologists in general, and to see what it's like to be in an event where there are presentations by a number of different specialists working in addiction and in various parts of the clinical space. So it was very much a learning experience for me in terms of understanding how people from that world go about giving presentations and how they go about fielding questions. And it was also just a learning experience to see how students react to that. So it helped me on a theoretical level with my basic research, which is trying to, you know, contextualize the insights of Gestalt psychology and to understand why Gestalt psychology disappeared in the way that it did. So it helped me with that sort of those sort of basic questions. But it also helped me more practically with questions to do with, well, how am I showing up in seminars? How am I showing up in teaching? Because I think it's important for philosophers, I think it's probably important for academics in general, that we understand the different ways in which we can give presentations and lectures, the different ways we can engage students. So it's helped me with my own teaching as well as my research. And I suppose going to Ethan's project on student mental health, I don't fundamentally in my own work think that teaching and research are fundamentally separate. I think that they're the same. When I'm doing my research, I am learning. And when I'm giving presentations to colleagues, I am teaching and I'm learning. And the same thing is true when I'm teaching classes. And I also think that when it comes to mental health and helping build resilience in student populations, a part of that means showing up effectively in the classroom. And a part of that means creating safe environments where students feel like they can approach their teachers if they're having difficulties, or approach their peers as well for support. And so talking to clinicians like Ethan has been really helpful for me in learning how to create welcoming environments in my teaching. And I try and start my classes with a sort of short message on mental health for that reason. So it's been like a very beneficial experience for me. Yeah.
Cool. I think, you know, so the whole origin of Bunri No Mori is cross-sector, bringing together, you know, we say, like, I don't know if you're familiar with the term of silos. I don't know if that's, we are siloed, and we are, you know, surrounded by people who do similar jobs as us, other researchers, and we're alone, so alone, surrounded by many people in our silo. And I think, you know, the Bunri No Mori was trying to break us out and cross over and interact with other researchers. And we had an interesting conversation at one point, which I think really sums up the problem of breaking that barrier. And I said to him at one point in time, because I'm a medical researcher, and the style of doing research in a medical school is different than in humanities. And I said to him, I'm a little afraid to talk with your colleagues because you guys are real researchers. You do real research. You read deeply and you immerse yourself in literature, old-fashioned scholarly research, you know. And he said to me, what are you talking about? You're real researchers. You do experiments and you work with people. And so we both have this block of what you do is real and what I do is just passing as research, which is obviously not true. It's not true, but we think this. We doubt ourselves and we think this, and in reality, it's connecting is so easy, I think. And it's natural for us to connect. You know, psychology is applied philosophy. You know, all of science came from philosophy. But psychology, I think, is especially close.
Right, it was only the end of the 19th century that psychology split off from philosophy. It was the last science to leave, and it's in a way it stayed the closest. But yeah.
And yet we feel there's a gap.
And we feel there's a big gap. Yeah, we do indeed feel there is a big gap.
Yeah.
And there has been, I think, a gap in terms of methodology, obviously, because you know so much of psychology now is empirically informed. And then there's obviously the clinical side of psychology as well, which is very intimidating for philosophers to be working with clinicians, because you know clinical experience is something that's unique and valuable, and the worst thing to do for a philosopher would be to turn around and say, look, my theory contradicts your clinical knowledge. And so like that's not the role of philosophy. That would be philosophy overstepping its bounds in some way. But yeah, absolutely. I think once you put those sorts of fears aside and actually start talking and put people in the room together, we found that collaboration was really easy.
You know, and now that I think about it, I mean, the gap exists, right? It's so close, and yet we feel the gap is large between us. But even amongst psychologists, there's a gap between psychology theory and practice.
Right.
In fact, we call that a gap too far. We call that the gap too far. It's impossible to bridge that gap, we say, right? Or is it possible to bridge that gap? So, of course it is. Of course it's possible. And we just have to talk about things and be open about the difficulties that we have from both sides. So, I think that was the goal of Bunri No Mori.
Yes.
Right? It worked.
Yes. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have so much to still talk, but now we are finishing the first half. Thank you so much.